Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I am joined by Harry.
Hello there.
And I'm Josh. So what we're going to talk about today is why Venezuela's economy collapsed. And
Quite spectacularly.
Yes, and this is actually very useful in demonstrating what good economic policy actually is, because everything Venezuela did is the opposite of good policy. And this is something that was suggested by one of our subscribers on the website, John Williams. So thank you very much for suggesting this topic. And if you do want to actually suggest any topics, feel free to let us know in the comments on the website or emailing me at josh@lotuseaters.com. And I always read the suggestions and I do my best to get around to them. I've got a nice long list of potential topics that's pretty extensive, so I may not do it immediately. However, I will eventually get round to it. So once we get into things, what's your general impression of Venezuela? How much do you know? I know you did a decent amount of research beforehand, actually.
Yeah, I've been reading up a little bit on it over the past few days, and I have read some books that reference it, like Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, by, I think his name's Christian Nimetz, which talks about all of the excuse-making that Western intellectuals tend to make for socialist states, which is something that we'll be getting into as we go along. And recently I've listened to The Case Against Socialism by Rand Paul, which has a lot of stuff on Venezuela. But honestly, given that I've listened to them in audiobooks, you know what it's like. Sometimes the information can go in one ear, out the other, because you're in the middle of doing something else.
I've listened to a fair amount of economics audiobooks, and I know that sometimes when it gets to the nitty-gritty, you just kind of zone out, don't you?
Yeah, you do. But as far as I can tell from Venezuela, all the stuff that I've looked into, they just suffered from every bad decision that a government can make when it comes to managing its economy and attempting to plan its economy, including the old adage of putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yes, and that is a very important part of it. But to set things up, I suppose, Venezuela is was one of the richest countries in South America, and they were very resource rich. They had lots of deposits of minerals, for example, and also one of the largest oil fields in the world. So you would think, well, for a country which isn't exactly massive, that would be quite good for the population, right?
Yeah, I believe that their oil reserves put like Saudi Arabia, all those sorts of places to shame.
So we look at the wealth of a country like Saudi Arabia in the middle of the desert. They don't have nearly as many resources and as much of a favourable position, geographically speaking.
But they are far richer.
Yes, which says a lot about what they did in Venezuela.
They always, economically, the statement is always that it doesn't matter what material resources you have that makes your country wealthy. It depends on the institutions and how you use those resources. If you have a low-trust society, corrupt institutions, it doesn't matter if you've got just a cave full of more gold than has ever been discovered in the world's history, you're probably not going to do anything good with it to make money. And
of course, the most obvious thing of all is they have large deposits of oil, and who do they have on their doorstep? Oh, the United States, who guzzles oil like they guzzle soda pop, as they call it. So, yeah, you've got one of your best customers right on your doorstep, and how can you really mess that up? Oh, wait.
Well, we're about to find out just how every decision you can make will mess that up.
So, I'm going to go through it chronologically, as you could probably imagine, and this has its roots all the way back to the 1950s.
Yes, because of how high profile it was, people can tend to just assume that Venezuela's failure was a result of Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro. But when you actually start to look into it a lot, it becomes very clear that these policies that they implemented or continued were basically just more extreme versions of policies that had been set in motion decades ago.
Yeah, when you look at lots of cases of historic things like famines in Russia, for example, you can see that it's set up almost sometimes 100 years in the past for failure.
And I was surprised looking into it to find that Venezuela had pretty much, since the 1950s, been a very socialist country.
Yes. So I think the first thing to start on is President ROMULO BETANCOURT, who was president from 1959 to 64, tripled the income tax rate to 36%, which is
quite a lot.
Tripling the income tax, yes.
Yes, I wouldn't like that, personally, if it happened to me.
And Of course, this is bad because if you increase income tax, then it stifles economic growth. Surprise, surprise, if people have less money, they invest less money. I mean,
but if you see economic growth as something being the domain purely of the state rather than of the actions of individuals sort of competing and cooperating with one another, then it sounds like a great idea.
Yes, well, I would go out on a limb and say most economic growth is from the private sector. I don't think that's too controversial, but yes, that's generally how it goes. So the next president...
I also believe that from what I've seen in some videos that Betancourt established a constitution, which was one of the things that allowed future governments to progressively take more and more power for themselves. So that might be worth mentioning.
So he kind of laid the groundwork for people to become more power-hungry socialist rulers, more or less, which we will certainly see with Maduro, who is still the president, depending on who you talk to this day. So the next one, not necessarily chronologically, but of significance, because I've cut out the ones that didn't necessarily do anything to contribute to the economic disaster, is Carlos Andrés Perez, who was president from 1973 to 79. And one of the main things he did is nationalise petroleum, as in all of their oil was now under state control, or at least majority state control.
Yes, and he also established a welfare state as well, which was...
He did indeed, yes.
Funded by deficit spending, which is always a great idea.
And of course, nationalising petroleum isn't exactly the best thing. I mean, it does work in some cases, and we'll get onto Norway in a second, of a case where it actually has benefited ordinary people to nationalise an industry, and I never thought, being the free marketeer that I am, I would say such disgusting things.
You held back your bile very well then.
That's all right. So after they nationalised the petroleum industry, there was massive corruption. As with any money on the table, there are lots of hands willing to take from that pile, right? And this is quite often the case when a government spends a lot of money, corruption increases, and this is something that's almost universal.
We should probably mention that the reason for something like that is probably to do with the incentives and constraints that you could reference in regards to private industry versus nationalized industry, where private industry kind of is incentivized through saving money and being able to provide the most efficient service possible so that people buy your product, which incentivizes, efficiency and good business practice. Government, state-funded industries don't do that. They, in fact, tend to spiral out of control in creating webs of bureaucracy. And in doing so, the more bureaucracy there is, the more bureaucrats there are, the more people there are who are willing to potentially speed up slow processes at the cost of a bribe.
There's also the idea that if you have money on the table put there by the government, they don't have the same level of accountability as a private business in how they spend it. So it's easier to defraud the state than it is to defraud a private company, which we saw in the UK, for example, when we had all of the COVID money up for grabs, and then loads of people defrauded it like it was billions and billions of pounds worth of money has just been stolen from taxpayers who were originally stolen from in their taxes in the first place.
If a government doesn't have the money to fund a service, they can always just tax you more or print more money.
So the nationalised oil company was founded in 1976, called PDVSA, which I'm just going to call Petroleum of Venezuela. But yeah, we can just say the oil industry for the sake of simplicity, because there's no need to
overcomplicate it.
Yes, exactly.
Trip up over ourselves.
So the next one who is significant is Luis Herrera Campin, I think it is. They've all got quite French sounding names, but he was in from 1979 to 84, and he introduced currency exchange controls and a wide array of price controls to combat rising prices. And this is a topical thing in the UK because we recently removed a price control on energy, and then all of the prices went up very high.
Well, I don't think it's that from what I've read, it's not that we've removed a price control, it's that we've raised the price cap.
We've raised the bar, so we've removed the control from lower down.
Yes. which establishes to me that the market is pushing the prices up and it was artificially being kept down.
Yes, which is, it's like maintaining a really high pressure thing that if you push down on it too much, then eventually it's going to explode. To use an analogy, I suppose.
Interestingly, one of the things that I've found looking into economics more is that oftentimes prices, as well as establishing, the supply and demand, also when supply is low enough or strained enough, or as we're experiencing right now, there are issues globally with certain trades and resources that we get. High prices can act as a sort of self-organizing rationing for people, which can often be interrupted when you introduce price controls. For instance, if a supply is low enough that you need people to stop buying everything all at once, because then it comes to first come, first serve. When you establish price controls, then they only will get to the people who are first come, first serve, if it comes to like bread or bananas or any kind of food, really.
Well, at the macroeconomic level, a price is an indication of scarcity, isn't it? If something is low in price, then it's abundant, and if something is high in price, it is either highly sought after or scarce, which can be more or less two sides of the same coin, really, because of course if they're sought after, they're going to be scarce, and vice versa. So this is important. And also another thing that's important is the reliance on oil meant that the bolivar, the currency in Venezuela, was tied to oil prices, because of course this was one of the main sources of revenue for the state, and therefore any fluctuations in the price of oil is going to affect the value of the bolivar, which isn't ideal, because what you want is a stable and secure currency which you can then use to, leverage good deals with the outside world, which is why lots of countries that aren't America use the dollar, because it's usually a stable currency, although they printed way too much and lots of people are moving away from using the dollar.
Understandably.
Like Russia at the minute is using the gold standard rather than using the dollar, because the price of gold...
I don't know if they've re-established that, but there are talks that they might be going into re-establishing it.
But nevertheless, that is more secure still, because it's backed on a commodity rather than...
The gold standard basically just limits the amount of cash that a government can print at a time to expand the currency, because the government just goes, we can just make more cash, but when you do that, it just devalues the current cash that you've got at the moment. But one of the other things that you mentioned regarding the tying of the prices is that obviously you're referring to it in a sort of inflationary way, where the value of the currency becomes less over time. Whereas if the price of the oil goes up, they're really successful, the price of the value of the bolivar goes up, then that makes it actually more difficult sometimes to trade with other, to export your own goods, because it becomes too expensive for foreign countries.
Yes, and this is something that we saw, I think it's called Dutch disease, the phenomenon, where you rely on one aspect of your economy growing to such an extent that it almost damages the others. And the oil industry, I think, basically carried the Venezuelan economy on its shoulders to the detriment of other economic areas. So they, for example, didn't have much in the way of their own manufacturing industries, and I think they imported a large amount of what products they had. And of course, relying on imports is an inherently unreliable process, because, for example, you have sanctions and things of that nature, which the US
become relevant.
Yes, the US did put sanctions on Venezuela for being a socialist,
corrupt hellscape.
Yes. So, the next person of note, or president, I should say, is JAIME LUSINCHI, I think you say his name.
He sounds more Italian to me.
He did.
LUSINCHI.
None of these sound particularly Spanish, other than, of course, Carlos Perez, which is...
Carlos Perez, Campin, whatever his name was, had Louis Herrera. It doesn't sound particularly French to me.
Yeah, although Louis, I mean, it's the name of many of their kings, but still.
It can be both, really.
It's not the focus here. So, LUSINCHI saw lots of corruption scandals involving elites, and obviously this is important because corruption scandals and money basically being seen as being extracted from the economy is really bad for investment. If you are seen as having a corrupt economy, well, people think, okay, well, I may not get any returns on my investments, and therefore I will not risk investing in there. So what you want is an economy which has a strong currency, that has a good exchange rate, and little corruption, and then you will get foreign investment, especially if it's stable and not entirely backed by a commodity which fluctuates in price as much as oil.
It will that level of corruption will also even encourage domestic businessmen and entrepreneurs to take their business to other countries. Like we see this in India,
Yes.
Where the corruption of the government means that it becomes very bureaucratic, very difficult to even get a permit to be able to license for a business. And if you've got too much business, then they'll just refuse you altogether for being a monopoly, which is something we've covered before. So oftentimes businessmen will just set their factories, set their business centers in different countries, which is not good for the country that they come from, because that sort of economic activity generates economic prosperity.
Yes, and it's also worth mentioning that this corruption kind of sowed the seeds for populist-type socialists like Hugo Chavez to become more and more popular. And Hugo Chavez was an army colonel as well, and he basically tried to position himself, okay, these elites, they're all corrupt, but I'm a man of the people.
Where have I heard that before?
Yes, it's a conventional Marxist trope, isn't it? Yes, I'm a man of the people. I've employed many of them in my factories.
Yes, my factories that it's terrible having to wake up to get there for 10 a.m. in the morning. Oh, the pain, the awfulness of it.
Yeah, poor
Engels.
Yeah. To be fair, he did bankroll a large number of people with his money.
That's fair.
Although he did bankroll Marx, so I suppose that's not as good. But never mind. So again, Carlos Andres Perez gets in. So
again, for the second time.
This is his second time, yes. So this is 1989 to 93. And at this point, the IMF were trying to encourage them to reform their policies. And he campaigned against this, basically, to get elected, because for some bizarre reason, these socialist policies were popular, these sort of nationalisation of things. And they wanted to control spending and liberalise the economy. And although he ran on a campaign of doing this, he eventually did give in to the IMF's demands, which were actually pretty reasonable for once. So this made him quite unpopular as well. And I remember hearing a speech from Chavez where he basically describes him as a neoliberal.
That's the go-to buzzword for socialists, isn't it, really? It's the neoliberal, you've got all these neoliberal policies, all that sort of stuff.
But it's a whole lot better than these socialist policies, because they actually, worked, unlike the socialist ones. So, of course, many of these reforms were limited by the fact that there was so much corruption. So when you introduce corruption into a system, it's very difficult to get rid of it again, which we see in Russia in particular, where the Soviets basically created a system which incentivized corruption in a way. And even though the Soviet system is no more, and although they might still have a large amount of their industries nationalized and a lot of state possession of assets, the corruption levels in there and the organized crime, it's still a significant factor.
Well, the fact of the matter is that unless you, when you change over a system or are trying to get rid of corruption, unless you just throw those people in prison, they're not going to go away. They're still going to remain in the system somewhere, exercising influence on things.
I think when people realise that actually being corrupt can make them lots of money, they realise that, well, it doesn't really matter what system I'm working with. There are always ways to get money easily. And you kind of foster a malaise, a mindset, and you also lower a standard for a country of how to conduct oneself. So in 1992, Hugo Chavez attempted a coup, which failed. So that goes to show that with the radical left, if you will, this guy wasn't particularly popular, and he's probably the last so-called moderate we will see, who wasn't really a moderate, but by Venezuelan standards, sure, he was somewhat of a centrist according to their own political standards.
Yeah, their Overton window that had already been yanked very far to the left over the years.
However, he was eventually impeached for corruption.
What a surprise.
Yes, who would have thought that there is corruption in Venezuela? So I've kind of fast-tracked to Hugo Chavez, who took control in 1998 and was in power until 2013 when he died. So this is the main meat and potatoes where all the terrible policies really took centre stage. Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the first things he did in 1998 when he got into office was establish these cooperative businesses, I suppose. So he established 100,000 worker-owned cooperatives made up of 1.5 million people, or 2 out of a population.
23.4 million citizens.
I don't know why I'm turning into Biden, not even able to read small numbers. 23.4 million citizens, and yes, 1.5 million people made up these 100,000 cooperatives.
I believe that's like 6.6% of the population, so a significant portion of them all taking part in these cooperatives.
And estimates suggest that up to half didn't even function properly as a business, which, surprise, surprise, you need. I mean, as averse as I am to top-down control of things, I think in a business you need a stringent hierarchy with accountability. You need hierarchy. You can't have...
You also need flexibility, which is what is provided by having someone at the top who is willing to take the reins and make the difficult decisions, whereas when you have, say, maybe your business is run by 10 people, all with an equal share, all with an equal say, any little decision can't just be taken by one person, and it has to be deliberated, which means that you get long, boring meetings where nobody really cares, and you maybe get one very passionate person talking about things, and nobody else cares, but also nobody really wants to change the way things are done.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.